Today, we've got a wild medical detective story for you. It's a case where a device meant to protect a person's brain ends up causing a totally shocking discovery somewhere you'd never expect, their abdomen.
So that's the big question we're going to tackle. How on earth does a life-saving neurosurgical device lead to a massive, nearly 6-inch growth in someone's stomach? It sounds impossible, right? Well, let's get into it.
So our story kicks off like a lot of these medical mysteries do, with a patient who shows up with a really confusing bunch of symptoms.
We're talking about a 27-year-old man, and he's lived his whole life dealing with some pretty serious neurological issues. Cerebral palsy, a seizure disorder, and something called hydrocephalus, which we're definitely going to talk more about in just a sec.
But here's where it gets weird. When he showed up in the ER, he wasn't complaining about his head. Not at all. He had bad abdominal pain, he was bloated, and he'd lost his appetite. And that's the puzzle, right? All his symptoms are in his gut, but his entire medical chart screams brain. This was the very first clue that something was seriously off.
Now, to even begin to solve this puzzle, you have to understand this one key piece of technology that's right at the heart of it all. It's a device called a VP shunt.
See, the patient has hydrocephalus, and put simply, that just means his body makes too much of the fluid that surrounds the brain and spinal cord. It's called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. All that extra fluid builds up and creates some really dangerous pressure inside the skull.
So, the go-to treatment for this is a ventriculoperitoneal shunt, a VP shunt. It's basically a super clever internal drain that moves all that excess fluid from the brain down to another part of the body where it can just get absorbed safely. And usually that place is the abdominal cavity.
So how's this thing work? Well, think of it like a really smart plumbing system. There's a tiny tube in the brain that collects the extra fluid. Then, a special valve makes sure that fluid can only flow one way, out. From there, the fluid travels through a long tube that's tunneled right under the skin, all the way from his head down into his belly, where it just drips out and gets absorbed.
Now, these shunts are absolute lifesavers, but they're not foolproof. Sometimes they break, sometimes they get clogged up, and sometimes they get infected. And in super rare cases, we're talking less than 1% of the time, they can cause something called an abdominal pseudocyst. Now, I want you to tuck that last one away in the back of your mind.
Okay, so with all that background, let's get back to our patient, because his history with these shunts was, to put it mildly, really long and really complicated. Over the course of his life, he had gone through 25 different shunt revision surgeries. 25. That's just an incredible number, and it really shows you what a tough battle he'd been fighting for years.
So after months of this stomach pain getting worse, and with no obvious answers, his doctors finally ordered a CT scan of his abdomen. And what they saw on that scan? Well, nobody was expecting it.
Okay, this is the actual wording from the medical report. They found a gigantic, fluid-filled sac. At its biggest point, it was 14 centimeters long. That is nearly 6 inches. And floating right there inside it was the end of his VP shunt tube.
The diagnosis was suddenly crystal clear. It was an abdominal pseudocyst. Remember that super rare complication we just talked about? Well, this was it. And his was enormous. But believe it or not, the mystery was still a long way from being solved.
Finding the cyst was a huge shock, but the next question was the one that really mattered. What was causing it? What was making it grow?
The medical team drained all that fluid from the cyst and sent it straight to the lab. Now, everyone was expecting to find one of the usual suspects, some common bacteria. But when the results came back 5 days later, it was a total curveball.
You see, most of the time, shunt infections are caused by bacteria that just live on our skin, like staph. But this patient's cyst wasn't growing staph. It was growing something called Nocardia paucivorans, a really rare kind of bacteria that you normally find in, of all places, soil.
This wasn't just strange. It was literally unprecedented. The doctors searched through all of the published medical journals they could find, and they confirmed it. This was the first reported case of a Nocardia-infected abdominal pseudocyst caused by a VP shunt ever in medical history. So what in the world is this stuff? Well, Nocardia is an organism that, lives in dirt. It usually only causes infections in people with weakened immune systems, and typically in the lungs. Now, it can get to the brain, but it's only responsible for about 2% of brain abscesses, and it's almost never, ever linked to this type of catheter infection. Finding it here was just extraordinary. Okay, so you have a diagnosis that is literally a medical first. How do you treat a problem that no one has ever officially seen before? The medical team had to come up with a really careful, really smart plan.
And their plan was just meticulous. First, they went in surgically, drained that huge cyst, and for the time being, they had the shunt drain into an external bag. Then they hit the patient with a long, heavy-duty course of antibiotics, designed specifically to kill nocardia. They were so careful, they tested his cerebral spinal fluid every single day until they got 3 clean tests in a row. And finally, since his abdomen was too inflamed, they rerouted a brand new shunt system to drain into his chest cavity instead.
And the result of all that incredible work? It was a total success. After 2 weeks in the hospital, the patient recovered completely from all the procedures and was able to go home.
But the story has a bigger lesson. As the doctors wrote in a report, this one single case is a huge reminder to always look beyond the obvious. It shows that these little internal highways we build on the body can sometimes carry very unexpected passengers, and a problem in one spot might actually have its roots somewhere else entirely.
And that kind of leaves you with one final thought, doesn't it? This whole mystery was solved because doctors were willing to connect a problem in the gut all the way back to a device in the brain. It just makes you wonder what other medical puzzles are out there, hiding in plain sight, just waiting for someone to ask the right question and connect the dots.